Many people gain weight when starting a pro-metabolic diet. So in this video, I'm going to show you the exact process that I use with my clients to consistently lose body fat and build muscle tissue, all while incorporating pro-metabolic dietary strategies and fixing metabolic and hormonal issues along the way. Now, before we jump in, if you would like to set up your own pro-metabolic diet, incorporating the very same principles that I've used with my client in this video, so that you can consistently lose body fat without crashing your metabolism, or driving up your stress hormones, I created a free guide for you to construct a diet specific to your goals. I'll put the link in the description. So in order to show you my process, I'm going to use one of my current clients who I've been working with recently as a case study. Now, for the sake of her privacy, let's just call her Jane. Now, before we get into Jane's personal context here, I want to preface this story with a few things. So, in podcasts and YouTube videos, I often talk about building a personalized plan. This is exceptionally important. Why? Well, each of us is actually quite different. We have different genetic polymorphisms, we have different hormonal profiles, we have different microbiomes, we have different health histories, different lifestyles, different symptoms and disease processes, etc. Now, with this, it doesn't mean that it has to be complicated to get your health under control. Many of the foundational principles will apply to most of us. However, it's important that we're actually clear on what the specific problems are in our individual context and what actions are going to give us the highest probability of reaching our goals in a reasonable time frame, so we don't go on wild goose chases or we start putting in different strategies and tactics that won't specifically target what we are dealing with. So given this, before Jane and I sat down for our first call together, I combed through her diet history, her recent lab work, like a blood work, any gut testing, imaging reports, etc., medical history, sleep schedules, exercise regimens. I went through all of these components. And what I did was I used this info to build out a custom health roadmap, is what I call it, or basically a plan for her. And then from there, to make sure that I had everything correct and I fully understood what her context was, we then sat down together for about an hour and 15 minutes to actually go through this roadmap, to go through this plan and make sure that we were on the same page. I understood what her goals were, so we clarified goals together. I understood where she was coming from, her dietary history, her medical history, different traumatic events that occurred in her life. And then also we went through all of her lab work, all of the diagnostics, etc. And we talked about, okay, these are the steps that we're going to move through to solve these problems, or resolve these problems. So she had clarity on that timeline. And we were also on the same page that she was okay and I was okay with using the specific strategies that I had in mind. And so the info that I'm going to share with you in this video is basically a compilation of the things that we had talked about on that plan, and then the notes that I have going through the process of working with Jane to help get her health under control. Given this, I'm going to give you the starting place here, Jane's starting place. So she's a 65-year-old woman. When we started, she was 170 pounds at 38% body fat. This gave her a lean body mass of roughly 105 pounds. Jane is in menopause at this point. She was dealing with subclinical hypothyroidism. She did have elevated antibodies, so they were only mildly elevated. She had a low DHEA to cortisol ratio because she had gone through chronic stress. She was also dealing with prediabetes and the early signs of insulin resistance. And she also had markers of low-grade inflammation. A couple of her inflammatory markers were bumped, and some of her lipid panel values weren't ideal. She had tried multiple different diets. So she had done low-fat diets in the past, low-calorie dieting. She also had gone through an extended phase of low-carb dieting. And then before her and I worked together, she had just jumped into bioenergetics, and she was trying to figure out how to set things up from a bioenergetic perspective, which is obviously how she found me. And so when I went through her blood work, a few key things really stood out when we started. So she was dealing with insulin resistance and the low-grade metabolic dysfunction. The way I gauged this was her hemoglobin A1C when we started was around 6%, and her fasting insulin was in the high teens. The other thing that she had going on is her thyroid function wasn't optimal. She was on thyroid replacement. Her doctor had put her on thyroid replacement. However, her TSH was still around 3, even on thyroid replacement. And her T3, T4 values weren't really ideal. Her reverse T3 wasn't too bad. The other thing that was going on is she had indications of chronic stress. So she had reported symptoms of stress. And on top of that, her DHEA to cortisol ratio was really not good. It was very low. It was way less than 10 when we first started. And then she also had some inflammatory values going on with her. CRP was in the 2s. So the trend wasn't great overall. And it kind of corroborated with her symptoms. The other thing that she was dealing with is that she had gained weight over time. So she initially lost weight with low carb, and then eventually she had gained weight. So she was about 30 pounds up, which is where we got the 30-pound weight loss target. She was having problems with sleep. So she was waking up 3 to 4 times throughout the night. She was dealing with it like just generalized anxiety in multiple circumstances. She was anxious for no reason, but also there were certain times of the day where it picked up and was the worst. And then also she was having hormonal issues, things affecting libido or water weight or components like this. So, and that kind of goes with some of the chronic stress, some of the thyroid stuff. We didn't have initial progesterone to estradiol ratio. However, because of menopause and because some of the symptoms, the thought process was is that the ratio was probably skewed in favor of estrogen, or it wasn't greater than 100 to 1 progesterone estradiol ratio that I typically look for. So these were some of the symptoms she was dealing with that kind of went hand in hand with the lab values. The goals were basically to address those components. And then I also added specific goals based in the lab. So we really wanted to see her hemoglobin A1C less than 5.6, at least, ideally less than 5.4. We want her fasting insulin at least less than 10, if not ideally less than 5. And we wanted to bring all of her thyroid numbers under control. So we were shooting to get her TSH less than 2. We were looking to get her free T3 values between 3.2 and 4. We were looking to get her free T4 values between 1.3 to 1.7. And we were looking to get her reverse T3 values less than 16, which they were already less than 16, so that one wasn't as big of a deal. We were also looking to dial in her progesterone to estradiol ratio, so to see where it was at and to correct it if it wasn't in an ideal spot. So we want to see at least 100 to 1 progesterone to estradiol. And then to manage the stress, we needed to bring her cortisol down because it was high. So those stress management techniques, also adjusting the diet. And we needed to bring her DHEAS levels up, which was a combination of diet and supplementation. So we got a 10 to 1 DHEAS to cortisol ratio to balance out her stress. On top of this, we really wanted to target her inflammatory values for CRP. We wanted that less than 1. And we also wanted to make sure that ESR, glyc-A, and the lipid panel, all of these factors were actually dialed in. And we followed up on some more in-depth cardiovascular risk factors like myeloperoxidase, lipoprotein or LPPLA2, and then also lipoprotein little a. So we looked at all of these components to kind of see what her risk was and see what other things we had to do. Took a look under the hood to see what was going on the cardiovascular front, because we did have this metabolic dysfunction and the stress going on with the A1C and the insulin, and then the DHEAS and cortisol ratios. So this is her starting place. This is where we're at. So step number 1 that we started with was the diet. So we built out a diet personalized for her. So we opened up her chronometer together, and I took a look at her diet, and we made targeted adjustments to her diet based on what her context was. And we tried to keep her original structure so that she didn't have to reinvent the wheel. And what we did was we looked to start for about a 20% deficit so that she could start to lose weight, half a pound per week. And then the next thing that we did was we hit the protein target. We kept it high, 0.82 grams per pound. And then the other thing that we also did was we started to shift the types of fats she was using to get a shift in her lipid panel and in some of her metabolic markers. And we also shifted her carb sources. So when we were looking at the fats, we tried to balance out her monounsaturated to her saturated fat ratio while keeping the polyunsaturated fats low. And we also looked to shift her carb sources from rapidly digesting carb sources, so things that people use when they first go into pro-metabolics like sugar, maple syrup, honey, juices. We shifted more towards whole fruits, and we incorporated some things like tubers and some cooked veg like carrots and squashes and things like this to hit her carb target. We also had to adjust her ratio between carbs and fats. She actually did a little bit better with a higher fat and not having the carbs as high. So we adjusted those. We shifted those a bit. She felt much better with that. Blood glucose was much more stable. Now, she wasn't low carb by any means. We settled 175 grams of carbs per day, but it wasn't, but she wasn't all the way up 200, 250 or something like this. The other thing that we found was helpful for her, especially with the sleep, was how we structured her meals at night. So at night, we backloaded with carbs and with fats, and we decreased the amounts of protein so that she could stabilize her blood sugar across the night and keep the stress hormones lower. And then the other thing is by switching to different carb sources and having standardized meals instead of snacking throughout the day, which is something that a lot of people do when they come into bioenergetics, we actually were able to better stabilize her blood glucose. And we'll talk about that when I talk about the CGM, the continuous glucose monitor that we use. The other things that we did was we dialed in her macros. I try to get as much done with the diet as possible. I think the diet is the best way to go. So we did incorporate things like liver, oysters, and eggs, but we did them in reasonable amounts based on what we saw in her lab values for certain micros, and I'll talk about that. And then also what we saw in her chronometers. So the adjustments were personalized. It wasn't like just take these random micronutrient supplements. It's like, well, where are you at with chronometer? Where are you at in your labs? Okay, here's what we're going to dose. And then we went from there. The last thing is we minimized some foods that we thought could be inflammatory for her. So we tested out different components. We tested out the obvious ones, dairy and wheat, and we saw her response. I don't think the dairy was quite as much of an issue, but some of the other components that we shifted, some of the FODMAP foods were causing some digestive issues. So we honed those in, figured out which were the problems, took those out. Not all FODMAP foods are the problem. Not all dairy products are the problem, just some. I mean, there's some protein powders that we were looking to use that didn't really work out quite so well because she didn't tolerate them very well. So we had to eschew those and hold those on the side. So once we dialed in the diet, this didn't take that long to do. I know I mentioned quite a few things, but within one shot, we were able to cover the vast majority of that. And then the next thing we did is this is where we dialed in the micros. So when we looked in the labs, or the labs that we had, we saw that vitamin D was low, copper was low, zinc was low, and then selenium was marginal. So we corrected these components. And then when we looked at some of the micronutrients in chronometer, we had to dial in calcium, vitamin E, and vitamin K2. And these were also important based on some of the cardiovascular and metabolic factors that we talked about. So we just supplemented those or increased some of the foods that were high in these things to get those components under control. And we follow up with the labs. Once we had the diet down pat and the core micronutrient supplement down pat, the next thing we did was we built out the workout routine. And the workout routine was a home-based workout routine. She wanted to work out at home, and we just used the equipment that she had on hand. So bands, dumbbells, and a weight bench. That was basically it. And we built out the routine from there. I adjusted the routine based on different movements that would bother her joints or something like this, or for previous injuries. We also modified the routine to fit her structure. So her daily structure. So a lot of people, maybe they can't go 3 times a week, or maybe you're a busy mom and you get 20 minutes, like a couple times a day, where you could do a couple exercises. So you can structure it out like this as long as the total volume for the exercises across the week work. So we personalized that for her. And then we also adjusted the exercise selection based on different body parts that she wanted to work more. Like, for example, some people want more arm development versus shoulder development, or they want their legs to develop, like their quads and their hamstrings, or their abs or something like this. So we just honed in on which were most important to her, or strengthen certain areas for postural concerns. That's another thing. In this circumstance, there wasn't like really anything super specific. So we just built out a workout routine that worked for her schedule. Once she ran the workout routine, got used to the exercise, we made some modifications, and now the diet and the workout routine were down pat. So then we moved to hormones. And so when we looked at hormones, the first thing we looked to address, because she was already on thyroid supplementation, was we looked to address the thyroid. So herself, and my doctor all worked together to dial in the thyroid dose so that she could hit the ideal values. So we were titrating the dose to get into the ideal ranges, and then also based on her symptom profile. So we were triangulating between dose, symptoms, and the lab values to make sure she wasn't too high or too low, and she felt good. So we got that under control. The next thing that we did is we got progesterone under control. So we started to titrate the progesterone dose to appropriate level. Then we did the DHEA dose and the pregnenolone dose. So the pregnenolone was low in one of the lab sets, and the DHEA S to cortisol ratio was a little altered, and she had symptoms of chronic stress and experiences of chronic stress. So bringing the DHEA and the pregnenolone were helpful for the stress specifically. The progesterone was helpful for the progesterone estradiol ratio, and obviously the thyroid for the thyroid. So we got those next pieces under control. Then we looked at blood glucose. So the blood glucose had been trending in a pretty good direction, but some things were going up, some things were going down. So we were like, okay, let's take a look at the glucose monitor, because I think at the A1C started at 6, but then it only had gone down a little bit and it was kind of holding steady. So we really wanted to get it less than 5.6 to start. So we got the CGM, the continuous glucose monitor, to see where her blood glucose levels were at. Basically, we found that with some foods, she's getting a pretty high spike after meals, like rapidly digesting starches. And then also, interestingly, what we found is that in the night, the times that she would wake up, or the times that she would have difficulty falling back asleep, corroborated with changes in her blood glucose on the CGM. And also, when she was waking up, she was getting very hungry. That's where we shifted the diet a little bit to have a little more carbs and fat at night before bed, decrease the protein a bit. And then we set aside a small amount of carbohydrate for a snack in the middle of the night in case she woke up, to stabilize her blood glucose. And then she was able to sleep much better overall. And also the A1C started to come back down a bit lower once the meals had been structured appropriately. And also the resting glucose across the night had improved significantly, because it was actually coming up a little bit higher, because she would have dips and then have a rebound up in the middle of the night. So the blood sugar was dropping and then rebounding. So basically we dialed these things in. With the meals, we wanted to see the postprandial, the after eating glucose. We didn't want to see it go higher than 140 milligrams per deciliter. So we were adjusting the meals so that she would stay underneath that target. And from there, she started to feel better. Weight loss improved a bit. And then also the A1C value started to shift. So now blood glucose under control, hormones are under control. the diet and macros are under control and the workout routine is consistent, the last thing we did was we started to dial in the inflammatory markers. So here we're trending inflammatory markers, things like CRP, which was the big one, is in the twos. We want it less than one. And then looking at things like glyca and ESR, other inflammatory markers. And basically, we put strategies on board. So just the general diet, hormones, and micros already help to bring those things down, especially as metabolic function improves. But then we started to bring some other supplementation components on board to help drop the inflammation even lower or have it move down quicker. And then we're just trending those values to make sure that they go into the ideal targets. And so we're on a downtrend right now. The CRP started in the twos. Now we're in the ones. We just need to see it get less than one. And ESR started in the teens. We're looking to get that less than 10. Glyc-A is in the 300s. We want it less than 300. So none of the values are really terrible. We're just trying to get them into ideal target ranges. As we speak, and this is after around 5 months or so of working, Jane is now down 20 pounds. So we started at 170. We're around 150. She's only waking up one time per night, but she is able to go back to sleep. We created a little snack there. She has no more anxiety. The anxiety symptom was gone with the dietary adjustments. There's no more energy dips in the afternoon anymore. So her energy is consistent across the day. The one thing I will say is that if there's periods of stress, it will modify that. So that can affect some of the energy. But overall, as long as there's not excessive stress, then things are pretty stable. Her A1C decreased. Right now, we started at 6. We're at 5.7. The goal is to get it less than 5.4. So we're still trying to get that down. On top of that, the insulin that we started out was in the high teens, somewhere up around 18. Now we're down around 10. So we're working to get that less than 5. So we hit the first target, which was 10. Now we're going to 5. The thyroid, we have all that optimized. So TSH is less than 2. The free T3 is greater than 3.2. And reverse T3 is less than 16. The free T4 isn't over the 1.3 target that we want, but it's in the 1.2s, not too far off the mark. And the free T3, reverse T3, TSH are some of the most important from my perspective when looking at some of the thyroid stuff. Now, the cortisol to DHEAS ratio, we improved from somewhere around 4 to now it's around 9. We're trying to get that over 10. So we're working on bringing the cortisol down now, as we already brought up the DHEAS. The other thing is the progesterone to estradiol ratio is greater than a 200 to 1 now. So we want it between 100 to 1 to 500 to 1. So we're in the 200 1. So it's been stable, which is great. And the CRP, as I mentioned previously, dropped from the 1s into the 2s. We're trying to get that less than 1 altogether. So once she hits her weight target, the full 30-pound weight loss, we'll follow up on all the major lab values, make sure everything is completely dropped. We've trended some things along the way, some of these specific ones, the more concerning ones. And then once she's hit her lab targets, she hit her weight target, and all of her symptoms are dialed in, then basically she's all set. And the nice thing about all of this is that the diet, the supplement regimen, and the workout routine that we built out, it's personalized to her. So it fits into her daily structure, her daily life, what she has going on with work, and she can easily implement it and she can sustain it long term because she's already been doing it. So once she hits these targets, all she has to do is basically keep doing what she's doing. The only real change that we're going to have to make at this point is we'll increase her carb and her fat intake once she loses the last 10 pounds. And since she didn't really lose much muscle tissue during this fat loss phase, she'll basically be able to eat the same, if not a little bit more than she was eating when she's 30 pounds heavier. And then the benefit, or I guess the nice thing with this is that a lot of the health problems we have dialed in along the way. So it wasn't just weight loss, it was weight loss plus resolution or dialing in of a variety of health concerns so that once you're done, you have a system that's set up that you can just run to maintain these things once you've achieved those results. If you're interested in working together to build out a personalized plan such as this, you can check out the link in the description below. Or if you want to know how I structured out Jane's diet to achieve these weight loss results, you can check out this video linked right here.